Hello everybody and welcome back to Big Johnny D History. Today we resume our look at Epic History series on the Napoleonic Wars with the next video, the Battle of the Pyramids. This is their first in their series of Napoleon in Egypt, which starts here, then goes to a Nelson's battle in 3D with the Battle of the Nile, then the Battle of Abukir. So we're in for a treat for these next three videos. I'm beyond excited. The coverage of Napoleon in Egypt that they presented in the Ridley Scott Napoleon movie was absolutely horrible and completely misrepresented everything that Napoleon did in Egypt. So I'm very excited to see Epic History's production. Their campaign of Napoleon in Italy was phenomenally done, beautiful presentation. So without further ado, Napoleon in Egypt, the Battle of the Pyramids. Sorry to pause it so soon, but I love reading these Napoleon quotes. Napoleon to the Directory in August 1797. To destroy England thoroughly, the time is coming when we must seize Egypt. And this idea that Napoleon had of going to Egypt and then working his way all the way to India to disrupt British trade with India sounds crazy on paper, and Napoleon was trying to replicate his idols such as Alexander the Great. But it wasn't unfeasible, and Napoleon presented this idea to the Directory. And the Directory wanted Napoleon out of there anyway after his glorious campaign in Italy made him one of the most popular men in all of France. So they were thinking Napoleon could have some power-hungry ideas, and he gave us this idea for the campaign to Italy. A lot of people don't know Napoleon wrote to the French government dating all the way back to 1794 that he wanted to launch a campaign at Austria through Italy. And ultimately, he went from Italy all the way to Vienna and ended the war. So this idea that Napoleon presents to the Directory, they're thinking if he made through on that, maybe, just maybe, he can make through on this.
May 1798. A massive French invasion force sails across the Mediterranean. 55,000 men aboard more than 300 ships, escorted by 13 ships of the line. Aboard the most powerful of these, the 120-gun L'Orient, sails General Napoleon Bonaparte. France's celebrated hero of the war in Italy has received new orders from his government. He is to lead an expeditionary force east to Egypt, the wealthiest province of the Ottoman Empire. And to all educated Europeans, an ancient land of mystery and wonder.
People think that Napoleonic history is old because it's 200 years old. Egyptian history, like when the pyramids and the Sphinx were born, try 5,000 years ago. There's an old adage that I've heard that Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, was born closer to present day time as of 2026 than she was to the building of the pyramids. That's how old these structures are.
After 6 years of war in Europe, the French Republic faces one last remaining enemy: Great Britain. The conquest of Egypt will strike a powerful blow against the British, disrupting their trade in the eastern Mediterranean and threatening their connections to India and the East.
And this idea of cutting off British trade to get at their empire because France couldn't launch an invasion because they have the channel in the way. It was replicated by Napoleon with the continental system. Neither time did it work. British trade with them having the strongest navy is very hard to disrupt. Ignore my tripping of words there.
These profitable trade networks help fuel the British war effort. What's more, it will extend France's revolutionary, civilizing mission to the people of Egypt, liberating them from superstition and feudalism. France's corrupt and avaricious government, the Directory, sees two further benefits from the campaign: the opportunity to acquire tremendous riches, and to get the alarmingly popular and ambitious General Bonaparte far away from Paris, where plots and coups are never far from anyone's mind.
Obviously, they would turn out to be right, as 4 years later, Napoleon would overthrow this exact same directory, well, minus 4 of the members. Barras is the only one who remains at the time of Napoleon actually taking over.
Napoleon is thrilled by the expedition, which he has done much to promote and organize himself. It is a chance to win fresh glory and to walk in the footsteps of his heroes, Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. Like Alexander, Napoleon even has fanciful notions of marching on to India to attack the British there. Europe is a molehill, he had told his secretary, Bourrienne. We must set off for the Orient. That is where all the greatest glory has been achieved.
And that's what they would end up naming the army, as the Army of the Orient. And Napoleon is right to a certain degree with what he says here. If you think about it, Napoleon ended up in Egypt, regarded as one of the greatest, if not the greatest military leaders of all time. Same thing with Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. These are some of the most highly regarded and most memorable figures in history, and they all went to Egypt. So maybe Napoleon was right when he said that this is where the glory had been achieved. And can you imagine if Napoleon had actually made it from Egypt to India, what kind of legacy he would have? He would be regarded as the greatest man who ever was involved in military, ever. So he wasn't wrong here.
But the Mediterranean is dangerous water for the French. While the Republic's armies have won great victories on land, Britain has cemented its status as the dominant naval power of the age, with decisive victories over French allies, the Spanish at Cape St. Vincent and the Dutch at Camperdown.
And we just watched the video on Cape St. Vincent, their first of Nelson's battles in 3D. Phenomenal video. But the Battle of Cape St. Vincent gave the British more secure access to the Mediterranean Sea, which allows Nelson's fleet to resume operations here. And Nelson very much distinguished himself at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent. And I believe at that point he had already lost sight in one of his eyes. By the time that we have him pursuing Napoleon here in the Battle of the Nile, he had already lost sight in one of his eyes. And I believe at this point he had also lost one of his arms, almost all of one of his arms. Someone can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, if Nelson still had his arm at this point, but I don't believe he did. I think it was in 1797.
Rear Admiral Sir Horatio Nelson and his squadron of 14 ships of the line now prowl the Mediterranean. Nelson knows a large French fleet has just left Toulon, but does not know its destination, which remains a closely guarded secret. Undetected, the French expedition sails south along the Italian coast. On the 9th of June, it arrives off Malta.
And when they were preparing this expedition to Egypt, they kept it under immense secrecy because they knew the threat of the British Navy. The British Navy had been launching all sorts of operations in the Med, and they were the dominant naval power of the age. They prepared most of this operation a week before it actually set sail. And a lot of people, even people close to Napoleon and high-ranking people within the French government, did not know about the operation until it happened. Nelson ends up finding out because they captured a French ship that happened to have the information on it, that had the operation, and that's how Nelson finds out.
The island is ruled by the Knights of St. John, a religious military order dating back to the Crusades. But the French have decided that they want it for a naval base, and a thorn in the side of the British. In 1565, the Knights had famously held out against a vast Ottoman army for 3 months. Now, despised by the locals, divided amongst themselves, the Knights surrender to Napoleon in just 2 days.
That him defeating the Knights of St. John on Malta is foreshadowing to what would eventually happen in Egypt, which was this idea of old combat. 200 years ago, it would have been almost unfathomable to take Malta from the Knights of St. John. But now it was easy. And you would see that in Egypt, where Napoleon would be outnumbered by immense numbers, including in the Battle of the Pyramids that we'll be covering later in this video, and Kleber being outnumbered, and all sorts of crazy odds that Napoleon would just defeat because of the advanced formations and technology and tactics of the European French army.
During his 6 days in Malta, Napoleon overhauls its archaic government, establishes schools, abolishes slavery, and requisitions money and supplies. Then he sails for Egypt, leaving General Vaubois and a 5,000-strong garrison to hold the island. But where is the Royal Navy? Back in May, Nelson's squadron had been dispersed by gales. He has now regrouped, correctly guessed Napoleon's destination, and is racing to intercept. If he can catch the French, British seamanship and gunnery all but guarantee the destruction of Napoleon's fleet.
Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not believe that Nelson simply guessed that Napoleon was going to Egypt. That's my first ever point of contention with Epic History on their information. I believe that Nelson had captured a prisoner or some sort of small ship that contained information of Napoleon's plan to go to Egypt. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below. I'm probably going to do research about that once the video's over. Very small thing, but just figured I'd mention it.
Then, a lucky break for the French. On the night of the 22nd, Nelson's squadron passes within a few miles of the French fleet. But thanks to heavy fog and darkness, neither side is even aware of the other's presence. The British squadron sails on to Alexandria, where they find no sign of the French. An exasperated Nelson waits 24 hours before heading north to continue his search. Just hours later, the first of Napoleon's ships arrive off Alexandria.
Why wouldn't they include that in the movie? Why? Why wouldn't they include that in the movie? That is such a climactic chase. The fact that Nelson and Napoleon's army would have been able to see each other if it wasn't for the weather at that one moment. And the fact that Napoleon gets to Alexandria just hours after Nelson leaves. If Nelson at any point confronted Napoleon's fleet, like when the fog was there, it would have assuredly been destroyed. Even when they take up a defensive position, Nelson is still able to come in and dominate the French fleet. So imagine how much history would have been changed if Nelson and Napoleon's fleet engaged right then and there with the fog. Maybe Napoleon loses his life. Maybe the entire course of European and Egyptian history is changed because Napoleon's crew obviously ends up discovering Egyptology in the whole aspect of transcribing hieroglyphics. So if Nelson had found Napoleon there, it would have been a butterfly effect that could have changed all of modern history. Go back just a couple seconds.
Hours later, the first of Napoleon's ships arrive off Alexandria.
Okay, I'm sorry to cut off the music. I tried to let it go for as long as possible, but like the way that they present content here at Epic History, Napoleon just finishes narrowly escaping Nelson, which would have been surely destruction for him and his fleet. He arrives at Egypt. This music perfectly encapsulates the tension and the excitement that Napoleon and his men must have been feeling to have actually landed in Egypt. Avoiding the Royal Navy was the hard part. Now that they're in Egypt, we can try anything. And that is further personified through Napoleon's quote here. This is a proclamation to his army on the 28th of June, 1798. Soldiers, you are about to undertake a conquest whose effects on civilization and trade are incalculable. We will make exhausting marches. We will fight several battles. We will succeed in all of our enterprises. Destiny is for us. What a phenomenal quote. Napoleon had such a way to galvanize his men, just push them on to feats that most humans would have never been able to obtain.
Napoleon, aware that British warships are in the area, wants to disembark as quickly as possible. 5,000 French infantry go ashore at night, storm Alexandria the next morning, and quickly overpower its garrison. The rest of the French army lands safely. Napoleon has brought 38,000 troops to Egypt, mostly veterans of the Army of Italy. The 5 infantry divisions are commanded by Generals Bon, Desaix, Kleber, Menou, and Renier. The single cavalry division is led by the towering figure of Thomas Alexandre Dumas.
And all of these men would end up distinguishing themselves either here or following this campaign.
He is France's first black general, born in what's now Haiti, to a French aristocrat and enslaved African woman. He has already won fame for his actions in Italy, where the Austrians had nicknamed him the Black Devil. There are more familiar faces from Italy. Napoleon's chief of staff, the indefatigable General Berthier. And brigade commanders, Generals Murat, Lannes, and Marmont.
And these are arguably 4 of Napoleon's best marshals. Berthier might be Napoleon's most important marshal. Murat obviously saves the army multiple times, including historically at Eylau. Lannes, unfortunately, loses his life in 1809, but one of Napoleon's most glorious and brave cavalry commanders. And Marmont, Napoleon's probably, what he's most known for is probably betraying Napoleon, but he would go on to be, he was Napoleon's aide-de-camp in Italy and would end up basically being with Napoleon his entire side. He was a genuine friend of Napoleon and then eventually ended up stabbing him in the back, which was part of the reason that Napoleon finally decided to abdicate, finally to accept the reality of the situation. But anyway, we're getting sidetracked. Let's resume.
The army is also accompanied by 167 scientists, scholars, artists, and assorted experts, even a hot air balloonist. Collectively, they are known as the savants, and have come to study Egypt's historical and natural wonders. But they and Napoleon find Alexandria a bitter disappointment. The fabled city of antiquity, founded by Alexander himself, has been reduced by centuries of earthquakes and neglect to a ramshackle town of 6,000 inhabitants. Egypt is nominally ruled by the Ottoman Empire. In reality, power lies with local Mamluk warlords. 2 in particular, Murad Bey and Ibrahim Bey. Mamluks were originally slave soldiers who once served the Islamic Caliphate. Superb horsemen and fearless warriors, they now rule Egypt with an iron fist, expropriating its wealth and leaving its peasants in poverty. To most Egyptians, they are despised foreign overlords, a situation that Napoleon hopes to exploit with clever propaganda.
And it could have worked. It really could have worked. And that was the plan that the French government had. They thought that it was possible that they wouldn't even need to really launch a military campaign. The Egyptians would never take kindly to the French, though. They just seen them as foreign overlords as well and infidels. So it was a good idea and premise, but it wasn't going to work. And the Ottoman Empire had been seeing decreasing power throughout the preceding centuries. Their territory is massive, but what they actually are able to control, a lot smaller. They're essentially a non-factor here in Egypt at this point.
Of Egypt, he proclaims, "I am come to restore your rights and punish usurpers. I reverence God, his prophet, and the Quran." Meanwhile, Murad and Ibrahim summon Mamluk warlords to the Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo. Here, they agree to gather an army to crush the invaders. Napoleon believes his best option is to strike quickly. Less than a day after his troops finish landing, he begins his advance on Cairo. But he misjudges the blistering climate and the barren, windswept landscape. He forces the pace, even after his men run out of water and are consumed by thirst.
And back in the day, during Napoleon's time, it was a lot more difficult to understand the climate that you were going into. Almost no Europeans to this point had been to Egypt. It wasn't just open tourism like it was today. And Napoleon couldn't predict the exact climate, probably using outdated maps. So it is to be understood that he couldn't predict the weather fully, although an Egyptian desert should have had some concern to Napoleon.
Hundreds collapse and die. A few kill themselves to escape the suffering. Bedouin horsemen circle the French like vultures. Stragglers that fall into their hands are robbed, tortured, and killed. Even old comrades like Lannes and Murat are involved in heated conversations about Napoleon's decision-making. The army takes 4 days to cover the 45 miles to Damanhur, where mercifully they're able to rest, drink, and trade for food. It's not a moment too soon. News arrives that a large force of Mamluks under Murad Bey is approaching from the southeast. The French advance to meet them at Shubra Khit, on the banks of the Nile. As 4,000 Mamluk horsemen come into view, the French marvel at their brightly coloured outfits, embellished with gold and jewels, and their many ornate weapons, including pistols, swords, daggers, and lances. Murad boasts that he will sever Frenchmen's heads like slicing watermelons in a field. But for all their bravado and panache, the Mamluks have neither the discipline nor tactics to face a trained modern army. When Napoleon forms his troops into giant squares, the Mamluk cavalry can only circle impotently, unable to break through the walls of French bayonets.
And when you're in this era of warfare, it's almost like rock, paper, scissors. That's the perfect way to compare it. Cavalry can beat infantry, but infantry square beats cavalry, and artillery beats infantry. But cavalry can encircle and beat artillery. So everything needs to be supported, and you need to play your game correctly. The Mamluks are just cavalry. Imagine trying to play rock, paper, scissors where your only move is scissors. Napoleon was able to form into square, and the cavalry could essentially do nothing. They could do nothing because horses aren't going to charge into lines of men. So the French could just sit there and unload fire. It just relied on the quickness of their ability to form the formation and their ability to stay in formation. If the French could do that, there was no chance that the Mamluks had. Maybe against a lesser army, the Mamluks might have been able to use their speed to overwhelm, but against the army of Italy, against Napoleon Bonaparte, it wasn't going to happen.
Scores are shot from the saddle. After 2 hours, the Mamluks call off their attack and retreat. They have suffered around 1,000 casualties. The French have scarcely lost a man. The victory is a much-needed morale boost for Napoleon's men after the hardships of the desert. The Mamluks fall back to Mberba, a small town on the banks of the Nile, across the river from Cairo. Here, within sight of Egypt's fabled pyramids 9 miles to the south, they will face the invader with their full force.
Did you hear that, Ridley Scott? 9 miles to the south. Not right next to it, you idiot. And Napoleon didn't shoot a cannonball into the pyramid either. There's so many problems with that movie. I'm sorry, I'm going to go on a little bit of a rant here. Napoleon didn't shoot a cannonball into the pyramid. He did not have to stand on a box to peep through a window because they just couldn't resist making the Napoleon is short joke. And ultimately, he didn't leave Egypt because Josephine was cheating on him. Those are all fallacies made to demasculate Napoleon in the movie, because clearly Ridley Scott is related to the Duke of Wellington. But even the Duke of Wellington said that Napoleon's presence was 40,000 men on the battlefield, so you can't even say that. Ridley Scott just hates Napoleon and made a terrible representation of him in that movie. Napoleon's address to his army on the 21st of July, 1798. Soldiers, 40 centuries of history are looking down on you. And that was true. It was over 4,000 years since the pyramids have been crafted. You could date the pyramids all the way back to before 3000 BC. They are old. Almost 50 centuries, rather. No, excuse me. Just have to compliment Epic History's production again. The smoldering sun that blazes, the sound effects, it really just completes the immersion. I pointed this out on their previous videos in Italy, but man, they are beyond themselves here with this production of Napoleon in Egypt. It has been phenomenal. The music, the visuals, the presentation, the pacing, all great.
On the sweltering afternoon of the 21st of July, Napoleon's forces approach Mbaba. He has 25,000 men, organized into 5 giant divisional squares, with cavalry and baggage inside, and cannon at every corner. Murad, with characteristic boldness, has crossed to the west bank of the Nile, leaving Ibrahim behind. Their forces total many thousands, but sources disagree wildly on just how many. His elite Mamluk cavalry, 6,000 strong, are deployed between the small village of Biktil and the well-fortified town of Mbaba, which is garrisoned by a mix of Ottoman infantry and peasant militia. Napoleon's plan is simple: to drive through the enemy centre and crush their right flank against the river. At 3:30 p.m, Desaix and Renier's divisions begin their advance. But as they move across the broken ground, their formation becomes disordered. Murad spots his chance and unleashes his cavalry. The Mamluks thunder forward at lightning speed. Desaix and Renier react just in time and close ranks. The French hold their fire until the last moment, then unleash a devastating volley.
See, maybe against a lesser army, it would have worked. He would have been able to capitalize on the breaking of formation, and they might have not been able to reform in time. Let's say if it was an Austrian army. But you're dealing with Desaix, you're dealing with Napoleon, you're dealing with Murat, you're dealing with some of the best commanders in history. So it just simply was never going to be close.
Horses and riders are sent tumbling. The survivors have no way to get to grips with the enemy, who continue pouring deadly fire into their midst. The Mamluks wheel back to regroup, but more charges meet the same result. Many Mamluks simply give up and flee the field. Napoleon orders the divisions of Bon and Vial to move forward. Once more, the Mamluk cavalry charge. Once more, the wave of horsemen shatters on French musketry and bayonets. With the enemy cavalry broken, Bon and Vival's men pour into Mbaba. It is a slaughter. Those who are not killed flee into the Nile, where hundreds drown. Murad Bey escapes with the remnants of his cavalry to Giza, from where he will withdraw to southern Egypt. Ibrahim Bey watches the calamity unfold across the river, then withdraws with his men back to Cairo.
Can you imagine if you're Ibrahim Bey and you're just watching from the other side of the river as the other army led by your contemporary just gets absolutely demolished by the French? You're like, yeah, maybe it's time to retreat.
It is a crushing, one-sided victory that takes just 2 hours. The Mamluks suffer more than 5,000 casualties, with heavy losses among their elite cavalry and leadership. French losses are less than 300.
Just an annihilation. Even if you look at some of Napoleon's greatest victories in the campaign in Italy, if you look at Bassano, if you look at Rivoli, casualty numbers nowhere near this ratio. And when you look at the casualties, most of the Mamluks were taken out. Their lives were lost. The French only lost 29 men, on top of the 20 men that they lost earlier in the previous battle. So the Mamluks have lost nearly 8,000, 9,000 men. Meanwhile, the Napoleon has only lost 50, plus some wounded. Insane.
Napoleon, with his usual flair for PR, decides this great victory will be known as the Battle of the Pyramids, just in sight to the south.
It's like Ridley Scott hated Napoleon but fell for his propaganda. Like, if I was Napoleon, I would have named this the Battle of the Pyramids as well. Realistically, we all would have. The fact that Napoleon was actually in the presence to see the pyramids, and him winning this battle basically gave him control of that area. So it's reasonable to say that it's the Battle of the Pyramids. Sort of. It should really be the Battle of Mbeba, but that does not have quite the same ring to it, now does it? But yeah, it didn't happen at the base of the pyramids. It happened 9 miles away. And that would have been just as cool to show in the movie. And then maybe you could have shown Napoleon with like the painting of him at the Sphinx. And you could have showed him going to the pyramids. Even if anything is not 100% historically accurate, it's better than completely moving the battle in purpose of a plot line and to have Napoleon shoot the pyramids for no reason. But enough ranting about that movie. I'm done talking about this stupid movie.
On the 24th of July, Napoleon enters Cairo. Parts of the city are abandoned and in ashes after being torched by the Mamluks in their frantic withdrawal. Napoleon observes it would be difficult to find a richer land and a more wretched, ignorant, and brutish people. Nonetheless, Cairo is the heart of Egypt, a city of 600,000 inhabitants, and is in French hands. With the Mamluks scattered and on the run, Napoleon's dream of eastern conquest seems about to be realized. Just 8 days later, the dream is shattered.
Nelson, Rear Admiral Sir Horatio Nelson, on August 2nd, 1798. Victory is not a name strong enough for such a scene because the Battle of the Nile was a pure domination. It was just domination. Oh, sorry, that might have been bad in the mic. I accidentally hit the cord.
At sea, Nelson and the British Mediterranean Squadron have not given up their hunt for the French fleet. Finally, on the afternoon of the 1st of August, Nelson finds the French sheltering in Aboukir Bay. With 14 ships of the line against 13, he decides to attack that evening. The British win a complete and stunning victory. The giant French flagship L'Orient is destroyed in a massive explosion.
And obviously we will... Oh my. 1 second.
Is destroyed in a massive explosion. By the time it's over, the British have destroyed or captured 11 French ships of the line and taken more than 3,000 prisoners.
Of course, we'll hear more details about the Battle of the Nile and Nelson's battle in 3D. I am going to be very curious to see how they show the Battle of the Nile, because even that small brief presentation of the L'Orient exploding brilliantly done. I have no idea how Epic History is capable of creating the edits that they're able to create to make these videos. It is truly out of this world.
With no fleet, Napoleon is stranded in Egypt. What's more, most of his army's cash has gone down with Lorient. But Napoleon does not despair. If anything, he is invigorated by the crisis. His options are now simple. He and his army must support themselves in this foreign land, or perish.
So now all of a sudden, Napoleon's campaign in Egypt is a fight for survival now. Maybe if the British Navy just simply was not in the Mediterranean, let's say they don't win Cape St. Vincent a year ago, they're able to be kept out of the Mediterranean. If Napoleon is able to get supplies from France, receive reinforcements, receive additional supplies, money, everything else that he needed, maybe, just maybe, he would have been able to make a pretty substantial conquest in Egypt. Because even in this, what we have now, he pushes into what is now Israel and Palestine and Syria. Like, Napoleon made substantial gains. But unfortunately, simply because the fleet was destroyed, the British Navy, once again, that infinite thorn in his side, put an end to it.
While General Desaix is sent south in pursuit of Murad Bey, Napoleon sets about reforming the administration of Egypt. The old feudal system is abolished. A postal service and hospitals are set up, and a new tax system introduced. Napoleon establishes the Institute of Egypt for scientific and scholarly research. He shows great interest in and respect for Islam, funding the construction of mosques and encouraging the observance of religious festivals.
Napoleon's acceptance of Islam and the way that he reformed and governed policy would not have been the way that many other European leaders would have done it at the time. Napoleon, in an era of acceptance, or in an era of persecution, is surprisingly accepting. And once again, last time I'll mention it, would a guy who developed a history institute and studied history all of his life disrespect history as the way they showed in the movie? No.
Such engagement later leads to rumors that Napoleon actually converted to Islam. But it is merely a tactic to curry local favor.
I think Napoleon had respect for Muhammad because he was a great conqueror to a certain extent, and Napoleon eventually, when he passed away on St. Helena, he was a Catholic. He had come to terms with his Catholic religion. He believed that since he was of Italian heritage, that he had stemmed from the original Roman Catholics, and that was ultimately the religion that Napoleon prescribed himself with. In his later life, at this point in his life, I don't think Napoleon was, he might have been somewhat of a deitist, where he believes that there is a God, or an agnostic, as they call it.
Napoleon also grapples with news that his wife, Josephine, has resumed her affair with an ex-lover. It is, he's told, common knowledge amongst Paris society. He consoles himself with affairs of his own, including one with an officer's wife. All the while, French efforts to win over the local population are failing. Most Egyptians see only foreign occupiers and infidels. The situation is already at boiling point. Minor revolts break out across the Nile Delta, which are brutally suppressed by the French. Then in September, from Constantinople, Sultan Selim III declares a holy war against the French. Now, the situation in Egypt is about to explode. Cairo, the 21st of October, 1798. General Dupuy, Cairo's military governor, is called out to break up a disturbance. He finds the locals erecting barricades, is set upon and killed. Soon the whole city is up in arms. The French fight back with ruthless discipline and crush the revolt. Some 300 French soldiers are killed, alongside several thousand Egyptians.
And for every moment of great triumph, great accomplishment, legend that we get from Napoleon in Egypt, there was moments of great violence, and it was a horrific campaign if you put everything together.
Napoleon ostentatiously pardons the ringleaders, while quietly telling Berthier that every rioter caught with a weapon is to be beheaded and thrown into the Nile. The French have bloodily reasserted control in Cairo. But it is clear, Napoleon will never win the hearts and minds of the Egyptians. The next few months see the French languish in Cairo. There is limited communication with France, much homesickness, and a dwindling supply of stores, ammunition, and wine. There is also an outbreak of bubonic plague, which torments the army.
And the plague is ultimately what I believe completely loses Napoleon hope in Egypt. If there was any hope for his army to hold out, which even after Napoleon fled and took some of his best generals with him back to France, the army still held out for over another year. I believe they held out until 1801. So if Napoleon didn't have this case of plague breakout, which happens a lot when you have these people from vastly different parts of the world and other parts of the world in these military campaigns, sometimes you'll even see plague like at Mantua in Italy. So if they're in a completely different land, it becomes even more likely, and it ravages Napoleon's army. And when you can't receive reinforcements, losing men to the plague, even if they're not fully haven't lost their lives, even if they just can't fight, you cannot afford that, and that's going to put your army on a ticking time bomb.
Thins its ranks. The only action is in the south, where General Desaix's column, 2,800 men, pursue Murad Bey deep into Upper Egypt. In this epic chase, one officer distinguishes himself. A 28-year-old cavalry brigadier named Louis-Nicolas Davout. On the 22nd of January 1799, he and Desaix inflict a serious defeat on Murad Bey, scattering his remaining forces. Murad himself escapes and remains at large.
Of course, Davout would go on to be arguably Napoleon's greatest military leader of a marshal, leading Napoleon's right wing on multiple occasions, and of course winning the Battle of Austerlitz, where he was outnumbered by nearly double by the Prussian main army and defeated them handsomely. And then of course Desaix would lose his life about a year later at the Battle of Marengo in the War of the Second Coalition with heroic actions. If Desaix did not lose his life, I would put money on it that he would have been made a marshal of the empire. Maybe then we wouldn't have seen Davout get to the position that he was in, but if Desaix was there with Davout in his corps or in his army, that would have been an army nearly as formidable as one that Napoleon himself led. I'd go that far.
But such military victories do little to change the outlook for Napoleon's expedition. They remain 1,600 miles from France, with no prospect of reinforcements or getting home. Napoleon briefly puts his hopes on a diplomatic solution. France's foreign minister, the brilliant, urbane and slippery Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, had been an early supporter of the Egyptian expedition. He's assured Napoleon that he will personally travel to Constantinople to smooth relations with the Sultan and win Egypt for France. But Talleyrand never leaves Paris. The Sultan remains furious at France's attack on his Egyptian province. There is to be no negotiation and no compromise.
We'll talk about Talleyrand a little bit more in the coup of 18 Brumaire video, which we will be doing, of course, resuming this series after Egypt. And there's a lot to say about Talleyrand, a very wide expanding legacy. I would argue the second most important person to French history of this era behind Napoleon himself.
Orders have gone out to every corner of the Ottoman Empire to raise troops to drive out the French invader. Napoleon's position looks more desperate than it's ever been. His troops cut off, disease-ridden, in the midst of a hostile population. He will respond in the way that seems obvious to him, as it would to his hero Alexander. He will attack.
Napoleon himself created the cult of offensive that we would see going into World War I. And it usually worked for Napoleon. Napoleon was the type of guy, when the Third Coalition declared war on him, why am I going to sit here and wait for these armies to form up? Why don't I go attack them first? Same thing with some of his battles in Italy. Same thing with multiple campaigns that he would conduct in the future. And Napoleon ultimately was correct in this circumstance.
One of the most important skills for any historian is to be able to critically evaluate sources of information.
And that is it. That was Napoleon in Egypt, the Battle of the Pyramids. What a phenomenal presentation by Epic History. That was even better presentation than their Napoleon in Italy series, which was still absolutely brilliant. But that presentation was on another level. The music, the way that they did the chase from Napoleon's fleet to Nelson, the way they did the Battle of the Pyramids, the smoldering sun, everything was perfect. The music that they used, I cannot explain how well the music added to the climax of the situation. I would highly recommend that you watch Epic History's Napoleon in Egypt series over the Ridley Scott Napoleon movie or any sort of movie representation of Napoleon in Egypt that's been created. This is the definitive information here. But I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Let me know what you think in the comments below. How far would Napoleon have gotten in Egypt, or even further to the east, had Nelson not sunk his fleet at the Nile? Let's say the British just didn't find him, or let's say Napoleon's fleet is able to survive and defeat Nelson. How much does that affect Napoleon in Egypt? I'm curious to see what you guys think, because I think Napoleon would have for sure made it further, but I don't know if he would have been able to invade India. Those are extremely long supply lines. The people were clearly not aligning with Napoleon, despite passing some pretty good reforms. Napoleon was a very good politician and government figure. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you enjoyed today's video. Of course, as always, check out Epic History. The original content will be linked in the description, and I will see you all in the next one. Peace out.